What's up everybody, this is Meher, and in this video we are going to learn about this keyword. So this video is part of a series where we are going to learn about some of the important concepts and I'll say some really essential aspects of JavaScript that we all should be knowing while we are doing our front-end development. So in this first video of the series, we are going to talk about this keyword, and the reason we are going to talk about this keyword is because it connects to two topics in JavaScript. One is your functions, because the value of this keyword completely depends on how you invoke your function, and then secondly, object, because this keyword is eventually going to point to an object. So before we actually look at how this keyword works, let's take a step back and try to understand why this keyword can get confusing in JavaScript. And one of the reasons I really believe is that when JavaScript was set out to being created by Brendan, he was very much inspired by this language called as Scheme. And Scheme is the language which has inspired other languages like Clojure, Haskell, and all these languages are absolutely pure functional programming languages. But after a few stages, the team and the makers of JavaScript noticed that Java is getting a lot of popularity, so why not make JavaScript look like Java so that people can easily adopt this new language which was meant to be the de facto language for the web. And that is when interesting things started to happen to JavaScript, because to make JavaScript look like Java, you have to bring in some of the concepts of object-oriented programming, which are like inheritance. You have to have classes, you have to have your new keyword to create instances of your class, and then you need to have this keyword. And it is for this reason some of the really simple topics in object-oriented languages become really difficult to understand in JavaScript, because JavaScript was set out to be a really different language and it turned out to be a cocktail of two different styles of languages. So now let's deep dive into understanding how this keyword works. So this keyword refers to the execution context of your current call, and it completely depends on how you invoke your function. And the important aspect of this definition is how you invoke your function. So now when we are saying how we invoke our function, our immediate response should be how many ways can you invoke your function. So in JavaScript, there are 4 ways you can invoke your function. And those are the 4 ways that is going to determine what the value of this keyword is going to be. And then you have your alternate way of writing your function, which is arrow functions, and we are going to look at that as well. So now what are those 4 ways to invoke our function? So the first one is your default binding, which is also the regular way we invoke our functions in a day-to-day basis. Then secondly, you have your implicit binding, and that is like when you have your methods invoked from an object's perspective, which is like basically object dot some function name, and you invoke it. That is your implicit binding. So the third way is your explicit binding, where you use the methods like call, apply, and bind. And then the fourth way is where you use the new keyword. I know the new keyword is kind of strange in this list, but I think once we come to that part of the video, it's going to be much more clearer. So in this video, we are going to strictly stick to the default binding, because it's, I think, easier to understand this keyword in chunks, because this keyword is not that really difficult to understand. It's just that it's a lengthy topic to cover. So what default binding is basically how you regularly invoke your function. So in our case, let's say if I have the same example, name is equal to Meher, and let's say I write a function called as getName, and then I, let's say, log the value of name, and I close it, and I invoke the function getName. So what the rule of default binding says is that in absence of any context, or in absence of any context, and also if your function is in the global scope, then the value of this keyword will by default bind to the window object, which is basically your global object. The output of this program is basically going to be my name. And why do you think JavaScript was able to get it? Because if I, let's say, log this variable window, and if I log this, there should be one. Yeah, you can see that. So basically, when we created a variable in the global scope, the variable got attached to the window object, and that's how we were able to get the value of name from our function. So let's say instead of now, if I write the same program down, and let's say I completely remove this variable name and I just invoke this, what we are going to get back is your window object. And this is the rule for your default binding. In absence of context, if your function is in the global scope, in the browser environment, it's going to point to the window object. In case of node environment, that should be an exercise for you. You should definitely check out what it is going to print out. So now there's a second part to this default binding, and that second part is basically when you're in this strict mode, which is, I think these days, the most common way, or most of the code bases are in strict mode. So in strict mode, basically JavaScript tells you that this is not going to point to window because this is going to point to undefined. So let's try that out. Let me create the same function and let's say use strict. And in this case, what we are going to get back is undefined. So let's say if I, okay, let me clear the screen. Okay, the same function, the variable name is already in the window object. So if I try to access this, what I'm going to get is a type error, because what we are trying to do is we are trying to access the variable name on the value undefined, which is basically your type error. So these are the two rules which apply to the default binding and which determines the value of this keyword in JavaScript. And that is it for this video. And in the next video, we are going to look at how implicit binding works in JavaScript.